This is episode 415 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here, get discounts on items in our shop, and access bonus history content for every episode. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned for even more details.
Hi, I'm Jem Bloomfield, author of Shakespeare and the Psalms Mystery, Did Shakespeare Help Write the King James Bible? And professor at the University of Nottingham. Another great method for studying William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
From the royal household accounts of hundreds of eggs being decorated with gold leaf and distributed to members of the courts.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Shakespeare's only reference to Easter comes up in Romeo and Juliet, Act 3, when Mercutio talks about buying a new doublet for Easter. Despite only a single reference to this holiday, for people of the 16th and 17th century, Easter was a major event. Holidays in Shakespeare's lifetime largely followed the life of Jesus Christ, and the resurrection of Jesus that is celebrated on Easter Sunday was a high point of the year's festivities. Here today to share with us the customs, foods, and yes, the clothing, like a new doublet, that would have been staples for the observance of the Easter holidays in Shakespeare's lifetime is our guest and author of Reformation England 1480 to 1642, Peter Marshall. Peter Marshall was born and raised in the Orkney Islands and teaches at the University of Warwick, where since 2006 he has been professor of history. Peter researches and writes on the cultural and religious history of pre-modern Britain and Europe, and is a two-time winner of the Harold Grimm Prize for Best Historical Article on the Reformation. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He has written 10 books, including a book on the English Reformation that talks about the history of Easter, which is what he joins us to discuss today. A full list of Peter's work and links to his websites and places where you can connect with him will be linked in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get into the history today, I want to let you know that there is coordinating visual history content about celebrating Easter in Shakespeare's lifetime, including portraits, primary documents, museum artifacts, and more, all packed into what's known as the detailed show notes for patrons of our show. On the regular show notes page, available at cassidycash.com/episode 415, click on the detailed show notes to log in or join us as a patron, and you can explore all of these visual extras while you listen to the podcast. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Peter. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thanks for having me, Cassidy. Delighted to be here.
We know that many medieval and Tudor customs are strongly connected with Lent. Explain for us how Easter is tied up with these Lenten celebrations.
Okay, yeah. Well, the risk here is that this ends up being a kind of explanation of the whole theology of Christianity, which I'll try and avoid.
The brief version.
The brief version, as people will probably know, Easter is, of course, the great highlight of the Christian year and indeed of the Christian faith. It's the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus after his crucifixion on the cross on Good Friday. And so it's really the point up to which the whole structure of the Christian year leads. And preceding Easter, then and now, but much more strongly marked and recognized in the Middle Ages, of course, there is this period called, in English, Lent, which weirdly seems not to mean anything grander than just the lengthening of the days. It's a kind of nickname for this period of 6.5 weeks, just over 40 days, which is a kind of echo and reflection of a famous incident from the Gospels where Jesus goes into the wilderness, the desert, and is tempted by the devil for a period of 40 days. And in the medieval Christian calendar, its significance is that it's a period of spiritual preparation for Easter. It involves reflection, penitence, and the avoidance of excess in all kinds of things. Probably for our purposes today, most importantly, food. So there are food regulations that apply throughout the whole period of Lent, which are lifted in time for Easter. It's probably also worth saying here that the period before Lent begins, because Lent is going to be a long slog for people, is also a period of celebration. This is called in the Middle Ages Shrovetide and finishes on Shrove Tuesday. In my youth, it was still called Shrove Tuesday in the UK, but it's invariably now called, I'm afraid, Pancake Day. But that in itself is relevant because Shrove Tuesday is Pancake Day because it's an opportunity to use up food items that are not permitted during Lent. And I should perhaps at this point just spell out what the Lent fast involves. Abstinence from meat is the key thing, but also what was in the Middle Ages called white meats, which is more or less dairy products. So cheese and butter and also eggs. So the pancakes is a using up of these items that can't be consumed during Lent. Totally forgotten now, I fear, but the Monday before Shrove Tuesday was called in the Middle Ages Collop Monday. And a collop is an oldie word that just means a slice or a cut. So this was an opportunity to finish up the cuts of preserved meats, bacon, things like that people would have around the house. So there is a theory, in fact, that Collop Monday, just before the start of Lent, is the origins of the famous English breakfast of eggs and bacon, since these are two items that you can't keep. And just adding to that, the Shrove in Shrove Tuesday refers to what's called in the Middle Ages shriving and being shriven. And this is a colloquial term for confession of sins to a priest and the forgiveness of those sins through absolution, shriving as it's called. So the custom was for people to make their confession in preparation for the Lenten discipline. What people did eat in Lent, of course, was fish. Fish was okay. It wasn't seen as being as kind of, sensual and luxurious and indulgent as meat was. It's a pretty monotonous diet of fish that most people are subjected to in the medieval Lent. All this changes quite a bit with the Reformation, but maybe that's something we want to come back to later in the conversation.
Well, tell us about the church services or religious ceremonies that would have been performed in honor of Easter. I mean, Easter was a huge part of the Christian calendar, but was it a key time to host communion?
It absolutely was. It was the main point in the year where people received communion. This might seem a little strange, even to people who know about church services today, because certainly the modern Catholic practice and the modern practice in Anglican and Episcopal churches as well is a very regular communion. But that was not the norm in the Middle Ages. There was a great council of the church in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, which laid down that ordinary people, lay people, had to receive communion and make their confession in preparation for it once a year. And that pretty much always happens at Easter. On other Sundays, people would go to Mass, they would hear the Mass, they would watch the Mass. They would, at the high point of the medieval Catholic Mass, see the consecrated unleavened bread, the wafer, the host, being raised aloft by the priest at the moment when it was believed it had ceased to be bread and had transubstantiated into the actual literal body of Christ. But that was a kind of visual and ocular experience. It was such a big deal to actually consume the bread, such a moment of sort of transcendent holiness, that was something you wouldn't just be doing week in, week out. That was held for this great feast of Easter. And Easter was, again, really a period of very elaborate, rather complex church services of various kinds. Beginning, actually, if we go back for a moment to Lent, after Shrove Tuesday, the following day is Ash Wednesday. And on Ash Wednesday, everything changes. Shrove Tuesday is all about feasting. It's about riotous games of football. It's about cockfights and, all the fun things that people did in the late Middle Ages. But Ash Wednesday is a moment of reflection and repentance. The ash refers to the practice of having ashes daubed on your forehead by a priest who would, in doing that, say, if I could remember the phrase correctly, memento homo quia pulvis est. Remember, O man, that you are dust, and to dust you will return. So a real sort of moment of recognizing the transitoriness of life. And all of this gradually leads up to the resumption of normal church services on Easter Sunday. I suppose one of the things it's perhaps worth saying is, we think of these things like Easter, Christmas as being a day or a day and the day after. But in the Middle Ages, these were seasons. And they took some time to play out. And the Easter season really gets going properly a week beforehand, with the preceding Sunday always referred to as Palm Sunday. And as part of the pattern, again, of the services, the calendar of the church echoing, mimicking the life of Christ, what this calls to mind is the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem prior to his arrest and crucifixion, when the fickle crowds at that point seem to be absolutely on his side and come out to cheer him, waving their palm branches. Of course, there are no palm trees in England, but people processed around their church, following their priest, following the consecrated bread, the consecrated host being carried in a special case, and would wave whatever greenery they had. So, budding branches of willow or evergreen stuff like a box or yew. So it's been noted that in some ways, although this is, of course, a profoundly spiritual and Christian occasion, it's also a kind of celebration of spring and the new life of spring and a blessing of that. So that's Easter services underway. And we fast forward a few days to what is now formally called Holy Thursday, but is well known, I suppose, to be particularly of an old generation, as Maundy Thursday. So this is the day before Good Friday, on which Christ is crucified. Its real importance to Christians, and this is back to your point about the communion, is that this is where communion begins. Jesus on that Thursday evening has his last supper with his disciples. They're celebrating the Jewish Passover. But Christ does something very unusual. He takes bread and wine, and he says to his followers who are present, take these things and eat them and do this in memory of me. This is my body, this is my blood. So that's the origins of the whole theology of what is formally called in Christianity the Eucharist, or the communion, or to Catholics the Mass, or Protestants call it the Lord's Supper, all these things, but all stemming from this apparent clear injunction, clear order from Jesus that you have to do this in my memory, and that this is in some sense my actual body. There is a theory that Maundy comes from the Latin word mandatum, an instruction or an order, because this is the instruction that Christ gives to his disciples on that day. But there's an alternative theory that Maundy comes from an Old English word maund, which just means a basket, because these were baskets full of alms, which were given out on Maundy Thursday. It was a great day for almsgiving. And another feature of the gospel stories, people may remember, is that Christ washes the feet of his disciples. And that was reenacted too, not so much perhaps in ordinary churches, but in the greater monasteries, abbots and priors were supposed to wash the feet of poor people in imitation of Christ. And the other people who did this were the monarchs, both Catholic monarchs before the Reformation and Protestant ones after it. Elizabeth I, in Shakespeare's own lifetime, would wash the feet of poor women before handing out doles and alms to them on Maundy Thursday. The idea was that the monarch would wash the feet of as many poor people as equaled their own age at that point. So in 1572, if I've got this right, Elizabeth washes the feet of 39 poor women, kisses them and presents them with alms. So in fact, the feet were all very carefully pre-washed by court officials.
I was going to say,
the Queen
I'm pretty
didn't
surprised.
have to come into contact with any kind of smelly, dirty, pauper feet. So Maundy Thursday, going on then to Good Friday, This is really an extraordinary day, a day of kind of desolation, really, because it's the day in which, Christ has been arrested and crucified, and the disciples don't know what's happened to him, and he's laid in the tomb. It's the only day in the whole Christian year, for example, when no mass is said in any church. There are still church services, but they are simplified services of commemoration, really, involving the veneration of the cross, what's called in medieval England creeping to the cross. So a cross would be brought forward onto the altar steps, and the clergy would crawl on their hands and knees to venerate it by kissing the wood of this cross, and then it would be carried into the body of the church for ordinary people to come and do the same. That's the kind of thing that Protestants really, really didn't like, because it seemed to them superstitious. Meanwhile, other things that Protestants didn't like, statues and pictures in churches, these had all been veiled during Lent, so that the colour, decoration, the sort of visual stimulus that we associate with medieval church-going is all being deliberately muted during Lent, and particularly on Good Friday, when the altars in the church, which would normally be covered with rich cloths and candles, are completely stripped and washed and left bare. And the consecrated body of Christ is symbolically buried along with the crucifix in something which is called an Easter sepulchre, a tomb, which could be a kind of permanent, rather elaborate stone construction, or could be a kind of temporary one, a kind of chest or a box. But everywhere, the idea was that in preparation for Easter Sunday itself, Christ would be laid in this symbolic tomb, and people in sort of teams would take turns to watch and pray over this Easter sepulchre until the start of Easter itself. So we're almost there. We're now on the east of Easter itself, Holy Saturday, when there's an extraordinary service which involves the extinguishing of all the lights in the church, complete darkness, and then the striking of a new fire and the lighting of a very large paschal candle. Paschal is the word for anything to do with Easter, really, which comes from the original Hebrew word meaning the Passover celebration. And curiously, in just about every country except England, some version of Pasch is used as the word for Easter itself, but the English, as so often, go their own way on this. So Paschal candle is lit, and then the first Mass of Easter is said, and there are bells and singing and kind of all sorts of celebration. And then on Easter Sunday itself, as we were saying earlier, a full, very elaborate Mass with the reception of communion by lay people. Only in the Middle Ages, of course, the bread is received. There was a long-standing idea that it was a bit too risky for ordinary churchgoers to be allowed to consume both the bread and the wine, because it might get spilled, and that would be a kind of catastrophe and so on. That was another great Protestant complaint against the medieval Catholic Church, that it was only giving out communion in one kind, as it was called. The world of, well, not really of Shakespeare's youth, but certainly of his, father's youth, the generation before, would involve this very elaborate set of church services at Easter, many of which were pretty offensive to the sensibilities of Protestants.
Peter writes that Easter, quote, was designed to impel people to make amends to those they had wronged, end quote, often involving the custom of annual confession in the week before Easter. Peter, in a Protestant country like England, would people like Shakespeare have gone to confession in celebration of Easter? Or if confession was one of those Catholic traditions that got left behind when Protestant England moved in here, what was the adopted counterpart for Protestant observations of Easter?
Sure. Well, there's kind of a short answer and a long answer to that question. The short answer is no. Protestants didn't go to confession, but it's a little bit more complicated like that. In so many ways, the English Reformation is an experience of absolutely extraordinary, visceral, shocking change, and in other ways of really quite surprising continuities. And one of the great continuities indeed is the practice of receiving communion at Easter, which remains very much, it appears, the practice for most people after the Reformation as before. The Protestant authorities wanted people to receive communion more regularly, but it looks like in most places they probably didn't, and carried on the practice of their parents and grandparents of just receiving communion at Easter. because receiving communion is such a big deal spiritually, you've got to be prepared for it. That means, for example, that you have to be, in this rather lovely phrase they used in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, you have to be in charity with other Christians and in charity with your neighbors. And we use charity these days to mean, giving to good causes. But in the pre-modern period, the word has a much wider range of meanings about right spiritual relations between people. So if you'd fallen out with your neighbors, you shouldn't be receiving communion. And one of the things that the practice of confession and absolution produces is a possibility of completely wiping the state clean, as they would have said at the time, being put into a state of grace, ready to receive communion, confessing all these kind of, sins of hostility that you'd have with other people, ideally then going and seeking their forgiveness. As a kind of, brief side note here, I suppose a lot of the time we're used to thinking about things being religious and things being social, and there's no end of textbooks that have titles like, religion and society in the Middle Ages. But that distinction between religion and society just doesn't work for this period. Religion, or what we would call religion, is so pervasive that it's very hard to say whether something is primarily religious or primarily social. And receiving communion at Easter is a classic example of that, because it's obviously a highly spiritual and prayerful undertaking based on these instructions from Christ himself, we were talking about earlier. But it's also a very social act, which involves mending relationships within the community. It involves, in a sense, staking your place in the community, because people didn't just go and receive communion willy-nilly. They went in strict order of their precedence and their social importance within the community. So you see and be seen in church going to receive communion. It's quite interesting that the phrase they used at the time for this was they talked about taking their rights. R-I-G-H-T, like human rights, but spiritual rights that were also a kind of social rights. And that's a continuity. Confession to a priest is pretty much abandoned by the Reformation. For Catholics, it was part of one of the sacraments, these rituals that were believed to actually deliver God's grace, his special kind of mercy to people. And penance involving confession and absolution was dropped as a sacrament by the Protestant church. In England, it wasn't exactly banned. In the reign before Elizabeth's, two reigns before Elizabeth, in the reign of Edward VI, the first really sort of Protestant monarch in England, 1548, it is made optional as to whether or not people wanted to confess to a priest before receiving communion. And the impression we have is that when something like this, because frankly, it's a bit embarrassing having to go and confess all your terrible sins to a judgmental priest.
I can see that, yes.
So, it looks like probably most people abandon it at that point. And that's really quite a dramatic change that I think historians have never really explored the implications of fully, because before the Reformation, in theory at least, the priest in a parish has one-on-one sessions with all his parishioners. He hears their deepest concerns, he gives them advice and so on. And that link is broken. Some Protestants, even those who completely rejected the theology behind this, ended up thinking this was a bit of a shame and wouldn't be good if we could, have a sort of Protestant version of this. And the prayer book, the English Protestant prayer book, which is, of course, reissued in a new version in 1559 when Elizabeth comes to the throne, did actually have a clause saying that if anybody was, not quite right in their conscience, then they should be encouraged to come and seek out their minister and get his advice and, try and have their worries put to rest. How commonly that was done, we don't know. And in fact, the strong suspicion is that, as always, it was the people who probably needed the spiritual counsel least were the people who volunteered to go and get it. So very long answer, but to loop back to your question, I think it seems very unlikely that Shakespeare and most of his contemporaries would have gone through anything like this confession of sins to a priest before receiving communion.
Yeah, not only was it difficult to find a priest who would be able to take that because of all the dangers of being associated with Catholicism at this time, but it sounds like they've shifted all of the getting ready for communion was a highly personal process. You would do that at home on your own if any, confessing of sins needed to happen.
Yeah, and the mention of Catholics in Elizabeth's reign, who are now, of course, prohibited, and the missionary priests who are coming in secretly from abroad are risking being executed as traitors if they're caught. As it were, continuing Catholics can seek out these sacraments, but at great risk.
At great cost, for sure.
But one thing Catholics can do is refuse to take communion in church. This is one of the great sort of loopholes of the law, because when Elizabeth comes to the throne, of course, there's no toleration, there's no ability for people to do their own thing in religion. Everybody has to attend church. Everybody has to attend the Protestant services laid down by the prayer book. And that is a requirement of statute. And if you don't turn up once a month to the services on a Sunday, you can be fined, and those fines get raised over the course of the year. So it's pretty risky not going to church. But the law doesn't say that you have to receive communion. Lots of Protestants thought it should be changed to sort of force the Catholics out of the woodwork and make them take this step of actual commitment. But probably deliberately, Elizabeth doesn't want to do that, because famously, of course, the phrase people may know about her is that she didn't want to make windows into men's souls. That's actually a misquote. It was said that she didn't want to make windows into men's hearts and secret thoughts. But what she's primarily interested in is outward conformity and obedience to her. So turning up at church in order to hear the services is fine. And if you don't want to receive communion, that's fine as well. The worst that could actually happen to you if you refuse to receive communion in the Protestant church was that you could be excommunicated. And if you were a Catholic, you're probably thinking, great, I've been excommunicated, I've got an excuse now. I'm not actually allowed to come to church. So that was quite hard for them to police.
So socially, there was a little bit of a game you could play there. And as far as Elizabeth's take on it, your heart was between you and God, but your behavior was between you and the law. Yeah.
And at a risk of sort of, setting a hair running, which we probably don't want to chase, we know quite a lot about practice of communion in some parishes, because ministers would give out tokens in advance to the people who were eligible. And then when they came to receive communion, those tokens would be returned. And we've got a very full set of records of communion tokens for the parish of Southwark at the end of the 16th century, at a time when a certain W. Shakespeare is living in that parish, and he does not appear on those returns. So it doesn't look like at that stage Shakespeare is necessarily taking communion in the parish church. But the whole question of Shakespeare's own personal religion is probably a discussion for another occasion.
It's a fascinating discussion, and we do actually have podcast episodes that chase that particular rabbit. I will link to these so you can chase that one further. But speaking of traditions that were continuous from Catholic England into Protestant England, Peter writes that hot cross buns, in particular, the food, were associated with Easter, but they were decidedly a Catholic tradition. Peter, is it true that this food continued being prepared in association with Easter, even in Protestant England, simply because the Protestant authorities didn't care enough about them to prosecute their use?
Yeah, well, classic historian's answer here, I think, has probably got to be yes and no. Or rather, we're not entirely sure, because there is a tradition, a well-attested tradition, of people consuming these delicacies, these hot cross buns, the special cake with the shape of a cross baked into the top. By tradition, these are made on Good Friday. But whether this is a continuous tradition from the Middle Ages is quite hard to say. And this is true across really quite a wide range of popular practices, because, for a lot of the time in the 16th, 17th century, the Protestant clergy were primarily concerned with reforming the church, by which I mean, the institution, but also the physical building of the church, and getting rid of what they saw as superstitious practices and superstitious items like Easter sepulchres and crosses and candles and statues and all the rest of it. So there seems to be a pattern that things that had been part of the liturgy of the church, the actual formal services, are driven out, but don't entirely disappear. They're kind of subsumed into popular practice. That seems to be the case, for example, with the branches, the palms from Palm Sunday, that practice of a Palm Sunday procession disappears entirely at the Reformation. But the making of crosses out of these branches and the thought that these might have protective powers of various kinds, that does seem to continue. Our problem is that these things only really start to be systematically recorded by the people I guess we could call folklorists around about the middle end of the 18th century and on into the 19th. Before that, educated people weren't really interested in what the poor believed or did, unless they were, Puritan preachers trying to sort of stamp out these practices. So the question arises of, whether there is a continuous pattern of these things right across that period of time, or whether they've come and gone and been kind of reinvented in the meantime. I mean, this is a little bit of a trivial point, but the actual descriptive label hot cross buns, the hot bit almost certainly comes out of a famous 18th century street vendor's cry/song, which I won't attempt to sing, but the verse version is hot cross buns, given to your daughters, given to your sons, 1 a penny, 2 a penny, hot cross buns. So the hot makes that scan.
We sang that song in elementary school as like a playground song. So
yeah.
I love to know that that's carried over and where that came from. I didn't realize that's where that started.
Yeah, but so there would have been cross buns before that. There is a theory that this has an origin at the great Benedictine Abbey of St. Albans, and there is some evidence that they made these special St. Alban buns with a cross on them that were distributed to poor people in the vicinity on Good Friday, and perhaps that custom spreads more widely. We aren't absolutely certain about that. By the time the folklorists got round to collecting the evidence on this, there seemed to be quite a lot of feeling that these were no ordinary cakes, and that by virtue of having been baked on Good Friday, they had real protective properties. I mean, I guess we could call them magical, right? Although the distinction between religion and magic, like the distinction between religion and society, is always a bit hazy. But the idea seems to be that, they wouldn't go off, they wouldn't go moldy, and that they could cure all kinds of ailments, and people would actually hang them up in their kitchen and, shave bits off to put into other dishes over the following months. Yeah, hot cross buns probably do have some kind of connection to medieval Catholic liturgy, but it's a very kind of twisted and complex path that we can't follow entirely and directly.
Well, what other foods or drinks might have been traditional to serve for the 16th and 17th century around Easter celebrations? You've already mentioned that they were coming out of a period of abstinence when it came to a lot of perhaps their more normal or even preferred foods. I want to say favorite foods. They would have had to given them up for Lent. So what would have been coming back into the kitchens of the English during Easter?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it might be worth saying at the start here, it's quite revealing, isn't it, that the word feast means two connected things. It has a liturgical, religious meaning, the great feast of Easter or the great feast of Christmas, feast days of saints. But it also, of course, has the more colloquial meaning of, a big meal. And that connection is not accidental, because these feast days, religious feast days, were also days of feasting as opposed to fast. So this cycle of self-denial during Lent comes to an end. And so people do feast on Easter Sunday. And of course, this would depend, as with so much, on their level in society. So in the royal court or in the great aristocratic households, there will be kind of huge feasts. A foodstuff that seems particularly associated with this day is lamb, perhaps not surprisingly, a very seasonal food, of course, in the spring, which couldn't be eaten at all during several weeks of the lambing season because they were Lent. So lamb as the centerpiece of a meal for Easter Sunday seems to be quite common, and there are some of these extraordinary medieval recipes that survive involving lamb stuffed with ginger and all kinds of spices, which we would probably find pretty gross today, but were seen as tremendous delicacies. All kinds of pies and beef, of course, poultry of various kinds. Special types of bread, often called simnel bread, which has come to mean in regional usage in England a special kind of cake, but was probably in the Middle Ages more like a very fine wheaten white bread of the kind that the poor generally couldn't afford. But of course, the food that is most closely associated with Easter, which was a kind of treat that the poor could afford for themselves, is eggs. And, eggs, of course, become the most characteristic Easter food of all, really.
So would they have decorated the eggs, though? I know today we have a tradition of, at least here in the US, we do. I don't actually know if this is there in the UK, but where you will dye eggs or decorate them by painting them or stickers or different kinds of things and use them as part of your celebration of Easter, which interestingly is kept in an Easter basket. And I don't know if that has any association to the Maundy basket that you referred to earlier, but were any of these traditions in place for Shakespeare's lifetime?
We think so, yes. I mean, the obvious point, I suppose, to repeat here is that eggs could not be eaten during Lent. So this is a foodstuff which is now permitted again. And of course, the hens might not necessarily have stopped laying during Lent. So people were probably hard boiling the eggs in the hope that they could be kept until they could be legitimately consumed again. So there are a lot of eggs around, and all sorts of practices do seem to be associated with them. Yes, the decoration of eggs, which was something I think I did at primary school, but and still happens a bit in the UK, but probably not as much as it used to. Most of the eggs, of course, which are consumed are chocolate ones, hey ho. But we do have I think there's an account from the late 13th century, so during the reign of Edward I, from the royal household accounts, of hundreds of eggs being decorated with gold leaf and distributed to members of the court. So that practice does seem to be going on then. There are various references closer to Shakespeare's time of eggs being coloured in various ways, sometimes, very straightforward ones of boiling them with various, other foodstuffs, even with grass, for example, which would turn them green, and then perhaps etching designs into an egg which had been boiled with gorse or some other product like that to give it colour. There are quite a lot of traditions around children, but also probably poorer adults going round the community and asking for eggs, this kind of semi-ritualized begging, which you also find at Christmas, but which happens at Easter as well. In various parts of England, this is known as pace egging. And this is an example of the word paschal coming in, because the pace here actually is, derived from Pasch. So this is Easter egging. So people putting on little plays and being rewarded with gifts of eggs. I mean, just because there was such an abundance of eggs, it looks like people did all kinds of things with them. Games involving rolling them down hills seem to have happened in various places. A children's game involving hard-boiled eggs in which you tap them against each other, and the person whose eggshell broke first had to hand over their egg to be consumed by the other. None of this stuff the Protestant clergy like. We've got a denunciation in the 1590s of pace egging and a long list of terrible things that ordinary people are doing, but very hard to actually get this sort of stuff to stop. There were plays as well. So Coventry, rather close to Shakespeare's own birthplace, had a famous pace egg play that was performed at Easter time, which, like a number of the great plays of medieval England, is put down by the more Protestant or Puritan urban authorities, but is restored again, and then I think put down again. So there's a bit of a struggle over these rituals and traditions, but they do seem to have quite an extraordinary longevity.
Was it traditional in Shakespeare's lifetime for families to gather with their friends for a special meal on Easter Sunday? You mentioned that there would be giant feasts at the home of the aristocracy, but I wonder if someone of the middling sort, like Shakespeare's family, would they have gathered with their friends for a meal, or would it have been just their sort of insular family that had a special meal?
Yeah, I mean, that probably is the answer we have to give here. I mean, one of the difficulties we have is that there's almost a kind of inverse law of historical evidence, that the more kind of mundane and day-to-day things are, the less likely they are to, produce a historical record. For the great houses, the aristocracy, where they would have household accounts which were carefully kept, there would be big feasts, and we've got a record of those. In much more modest households, that kind of record is not created, and we don't really yet have enough of a volume of what historians call, in a rather ugly term, I always think, ego documents, So diaries or letters to see what people are doing on a kind of day-to-day basis. But it's very likely, I think, that people did. I mean, if you're feasting, nobody feasts on their own, right? I mean, eating is always a very sort of communal occasion. I'm sure that families did, gather, and perhaps with neighbors as well, to eat, at whatever level they could afford to do so.
I have to think that they would have wanted people to come, because I'm thinking I have 11 chickens that I keep in my backyard, and they will produce way more eggs than I can eat on a normal basis. So if we weren't eating them, we would very quickly gather up a whole bunch. So I would think you'd be finding friends, strangers, please take these. I have tons of them. So when it came to Easter, you'd be passing them around to everyone you could find.
Yeah. You actually have to give some of them to the church, I'm afraid, because there was not surprisingly, this is a tradition which does survive across the Reformation, which is the making of offerings at Easter to the church and to the clergy, which could be in money, but for poorer people without ready money, eggs were often the most obvious currency in which to make those offerings.
Which I bet they would have transported in an Easter basket. And I think
I'm sure they would.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Now, Shakespeare has Mercutio reference a special doublet worn for Easter. As far as I know, this is Shakespeare's only direct reference to Easter in his works. But was Easter Sunday a time that people would wear new clothes? Would they have dressed up to go to church on this holiday?
Yes, I think they would, and as far as they could. And not that I didn't believe you, but I did my own quick check in the online Shakespeare concordances for Easter earlier this afternoon, and you're absolutely right. Rather surprisingly, that is the only direct reference to Easter in the whole canon. So yes, I think this is part of the sort of the general feeling that Easter is a new start. It's a time of sort of rebirth, renewal. The other thing that people probably did at Easter was to clean their houses. We have late medieval sources talking about the putting down of new rushes in the household and so on. Yes, a number of Shakespeare's contemporaries, people like Thomas Lodge or Nicholas Breton, do make references to tailors being very busy at Easter, and to, even, they're always a bit snobbish, of course, in writing about ordinary people, but, even ordinary farmers have to get their suit of silk at Easter. Of course, new clothes, which, we don't necessarily think of as a big deal, were a very big deal for most ordinary people in this period. People did not buy new clothes. They reworked what they had, and clothes were passed on from generation to generation. But in as far as they could, I think people did try to equip themselves with new items of apparel. Once we start getting rather more of these so-called ego documents in the late 17th century, this does seem to be the pattern. Samuel Pepys, I suppose, the most famous diarist, and Pepys didn't necessarily buy brand new clothes at Easter, but he had his old suits sort of trimmed up, he said, for Easter Sunday. And in Pepys's time, there's a rather popular publication called Poor Robin's Almanac, which is full of all kinds of, tidbits and advice for the year. It has this rather wonderful couplet in it: "At Easter, let your clothes be new, or else be sure you will it rue." So a little proverb recorded there in the later 17th century, but is almost certainly considerably older. And that aspiration of having new clothes at Easter is probably pretty widespread and pretty ancient. The folklorists I was talking about earlier in the 18th century are recording people giving each other gloves at Easter, or women who couldn't perhaps necessarily afford complete new items of clothing, buying bits of linen, handkerchiefs and ribbons and so on, so that there is some sort of new item. The newness, of course, might sometimes be in something that is new to you, as it were. So in the greater households, there was probably a kind of cascading of clothes as the aristocrats themselves acquired completely new sets of clothing, and their cast-offs were passed on to favoured servants, and they in turn passed on things to kinsfolk as well. So yes, it's part of this whole theme about Easter being this moment of rebirth and renewal, and a kind of cleansing and washing, which is both spiritual but also quite practical as well.
You've mentioned that this was a time of fundraising in the local churches and parishes of England where the people were expected to give either money or eggs to their parishes. But Peter, tell us about what this practice called the church ale, parish plays, and this celebration specifically known as Hocktide. These things were staged during the Easter season, but what were these customs and how were they used to raise money over the Easter season?
Yeah, Easter season is absolutely right, which is kind of a full fortnight, really, from Holy Week and Palm Sunday right through to the week following Easter. And the 2 days in the week after that, so the second Monday and Tuesday after Easter, are traditionally the Hocking days, Hock Monday and Hock Tuesday. Now, nobody really knows what Hock means in this context. There are all kinds of theories about it, but it's never really been settled. I mean, it's quite nice sometimes when things are just mysterious. But it's another of these points of their holidays, so that they're times of celebration. And they're also times of what is sometimes called misrule, to a rather nice phrase, a kind of permitted or ritualized disorder when the normal rules of society are temporarily suspended. This is true of, class distinctions, but also true of gender. And the great hawking activity involves gangs of men and women in the parish kidnapping each other and tying up members of the other sex and then releasing them in return for a ransom being paid. So this is the fundraising aspect. And you could see this as all good, clean fun, or as, risky and likely to lead to all sorts of terrible things if you were a Puritan preacher, which no doubt it sometimes did. Interestingly, as far as we can tell from the parish accounts which record this, they stopped recording it after the Reformation, but in the century before the Reformation, the amounts that are raised for the church through these Hocktide activities are recorded. And it does seem that the gangs of women nearly always raised much more money than the men did. And in some places, the tradition of men going out and doing the hawking was abandoned. And it was just groups of often married women, but sometimes maidens as well, who in this subversion of the normal rules of gender ranking would assert power over men by taking them under their control. There was a sort of suggestion that this was referencing a period in England's dim and distant past where women had resisted invasion by the Danes. That was the sort of conceit that lay behind some of it, but whether there's any truth to that is almost kind of impossible to say. So yeah, there are these fun activities that raise money, and at the same time there would be these events called church ales. The clue's in the name, really. This is, I guess, what in a modern context would be called a church fete or a church fair, but the main activity involved was the brewing and consumption of ale, with the proceeds going to the church. And before they started being suppressed and banned in various places, another time when plays would be put on, which were again partly entertainment, but also a means of raising money for the community.
It's so surprising to me to think about the church ale, because typically today a celebration around drinking of beer or alcohol would definitely not be a church-related activity. So it's very funny to think about this happening. I think here in the US, or at least the southern part, I'm in Alabama, and we have an activity around Easter called Dinner on the Grounds, which is where everyone gets together at the church to share a meal. And I want to think that a church ale from Shakespeare's lifetime would be pretty analogous to Dinner on the Grounds for anyone here in Alabama that needs a personal analog for that activity.
Sure. Yeah, I think that sort of, obviously drunkenness is seen as a great sin, but opposition to alcohol per se doesn't really seem to be much of a feature. This is something that's well known and would surprise people to hear. You couldn't really drink the water much of the time in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. So beer of some kind, even if it was weak or small beer, is very widely consumed, even by children. It didn't actually occur to me until I'd started to be thinking about some of the questions you might be asking me that the dietary restrictions for Lent are pretty much all foodstuffs and not drink. So people probably carried on drinking as they had done during the period of Lent. I did read somewhere, this is not entirely relevant to England, but it's rather interesting, that when chocolate is discovered, of course, this great Aztec delicacy by the Spaniards through their conquest of the New World and starts to make its way back to Europe, there were great theological debates about whether chocolate was a food or a drink. And the theologians tended to solemnly rule that it was indeed a drink, meaning that you could consume it legitimately during Lent.
I'm so glad to know that, for how else would we have survived?
Well, indeed.
Now, I know there's a lot more history that we could explore here about the history of Easter and how it was practiced in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. So what are some of your resources you can recommend that we start with if we're new to this history and we want to learn more?
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot been written about these things, as you might imagine. For my money, the best historian to go to is my friend Ronald Hutton, formerly of the University of Bristol in the UK, who was both a great historian of religion, but also a folklorist. And he's written a pair of really rather wonderful books, one of which is called The Rise and Fall of Merry England, and a kind of sequel to it called The Stations of the Sun, a history of the ritual year in Britain. Ronald goes through these different periods of the church's year, not just Easter, but all the various points through the calendar, and tries to explain the origins and the meaning of the rituals that were associated with them. On the more sort of strictly religious stuff, probably the most important book that's been written about the impact of the Reformation on Easter and all the other celebrations of the church is my other friend, Eamon Duffy's wonderful book from the 1990s called The Stripping of the Altars, Traditional Religion in England, 1400 to 1580. The stripping of the altars in the title is quite a clever one, because that refers specifically to this Catholic Easter time ritual of making the altars bare for Good Friday. But of course, in the context of the book, Eamon Duffy uses it as a metaphor for the much more wide-ranging sort of devastation of traditional Catholic ritual and ceremony that the Reformation brings about. And beyond that, Shakespearean scholars have done lots of interesting work on Shakespeare's connections with popular culture and festive ritual. So I think, just to pick one of these books, which I think would be useful, Phoebe Jensen's 2008 work on, if I can remember the title exactly, Religion and Revelry in Shakespeare's Festive World. So there's loads of things that people can go to follow this up. And of course, it needs to be said, the internet is if you're careful, is a wonderful source of all kinds of information on these customs. And good historians are blogging about Easter and other food and calendar traditions.
Absolutely. I think the internet is a great place. I mean, always look for sources and verify what you're reading, but there's tons to uncover. And we will place links to Peter's work as well as these resources he's recommended for you in the show notes today, so that you can go and find that and start your investigation into the history of Easter. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Peter, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those. And apparently on the original Desert Island Discs show, which is what this question is based upon, you were also offered a luxury item. So you may select a luxury item if you would like to take that on your island stay as well.
Okay, I was thinking very hard about this in advance of the interview, and the complete works of Shakespeare. So that's all your entertainment needs covered, right? It's Netflix right there. Tragedy, comedy, drama, history, and all the spiritual side is covered by the Bible. I think if I was stuck there for some time, I would take an atlas of the world, so I could kind of travel in my mind and pore over maps, which I've always enjoyed looking at, and thinking about places I'd be allowed to go when I got off the island. The luxury. Okay, so rather appropriately to our discussion, I don't know if you have in the US an item called Cadbury's cream eggs.
We do, yes.
Small chocolate eggs. Yeah, they are ridiculously sweet, stuffed with this white and yellow fondant, incredibly bad for you. I shouldn't eat them, but ever since I was a child, I absolutely loved them, and I will certainly be having some, this Easter. So on the desert island, I'd probably be eating loads of fruit and stuff that was really good for me. So I think, 1 or 2 cream eggs I could perhaps get away with.
We do have Cadbury cream eggs, and they're huge here at Easter time. Lots of people have them and enjoy them. And I think between having your entertainment sorted, the Bible there for you, and an atlas for your very intelligent selection, you have perhaps the perfect desert island setup there.
I'm quite keen to go now, thinking about all that.
What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
A number of things. So I've been working in the last few years actually on something rather different, which is a history of the Orkney Islands off the northeast coast of Scotland, which is now available, plug, in paperback. And this seems a bit of a sort of indulgence because this is where I was born and grew up. So I have a kind of patriotic interest in the islands. But I also try in this book to offer what I rather grandly call an alternative history of Britain. So recentering things away from London and Edinburgh and the great events that we know about, and thinking how the history of early modern Britain looks from the perspective of the island fringe. I've also got a short book on Thomas More, which I think is coming out pretty shortly. And I've been a bit sort of drawn back to the Tudors. So I'm thinking about, maybe writing a book on the Pilgrimage of Grace, that great extraordinary rebellion of 1536 to 7, which almost changes the course of English history and reverses the Reformation in the generation before Shakespeare's birth. So quite a few things to keep me going.
Very exciting stuff coming from Peter Marshall. And again, we'll place links to his work in the show notes today, so you can make sure to find these publications and follow what he is working on. Thank you, Peter Marshall, for joining us this week to share with us what the history of Easter was like for Shakespeare's lifetime. I'm personally thrilled to know that Shakespeare might have enjoyed things like chocolate as well as eggs in a basket during this season. And we can feel that much more connected to the past with these traditions. Thank you for bringing this history to life for us today. And I hope you, too, enjoy a wonderful Easter season.
It's been a very great pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you would like more information on Peter's work and a clickable list of the resources he recommends for you today, then be sure to check out the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 415. There you will also find links to the related podcast episodes on Catholicism in England and the conflict there between Catholicism and Protestantism, along with special extras that I've packed in there just to make your listening experience that much more fun. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP415. Remember that while you're there, if you want to see the bonus content, including primary documents, museum artifacts, period paintings related to Easter in England for Shakespeare's lifetime, then be sure to click on the detailed show notes button. Patrons of our show can log in there, or you can join us if you're not already a supporter of the show, and all the extras will expand right on the website. If you're a studio insider or higher on our Patreon page, you can also access the digital downloads library, which includes diagrams for Easter to help you remember all the different days of Easter week and what they were celebrated with and why, and other bonus extras like that are available inside the digital library. You can find all of that on our Patreon page at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you enjoy this Easter season and that our episode today helps you enjoy it that much more. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.